As the world continues to battle with poverty and unaffordable healthcare, there is one place where people can perhaps find a ray of hope, and that is the Gates Foundation. It is my pleasure to welcome Mark Suzman, who is the President of Global Policy, Advocacy and Country Programs at the Foundation right here on ET Now. Impatient optimists is how the Foundation describes people like yourselves. Help us understand, what does that phrase mean? It fascinated me to no end. Obviously, there's a lot of optimism around what you're doing, but why the impatience?
Well, I mean, first actually to define the optimism more clearly, it's a sense that change is fundamentally possible even for the very poorest. That's something that often isn't understood and isn't believed. There's a lot of skepticism globally about, are things really getting better? Aren't the poor always with us? Can we really make traction on healthcare? And Bill and Melinda Gates, as our founders, and certainly all the work of the foundation, fundamentally say, yes, not only is progress possible, but it is happening. We've seen it in progress in reductions in child and maternal mortality, and reductions in poverty, and increased access to clean water over the last 15 years. In fact, by some measures, the improvements in daily life globally over the last 15 years have been greater than any comparable period in human history. And so the optimism comes from change is possible, it's happening, but it can and should be accelerated. For all the progress we've had, there's a deep frustration that there's still over 1 billion people in poverty,
right. Yes.
that 6 million children under 5 still die needlessly every year. And that's the impatience that drives us, saying that shouldn't be the case. We have the tools, we have the technology, we have the resources, we have the know-how. How can we stop that happening, and how can we make those improvements go even faster? And that's the impatience. And so the combination really is at the heart of who we are as a foundation.
You know, while your foundation has some of the biggest names in the world of corporates backing it, Bill and Melinda Gates, that's not the case with many other foundations. The question that I would want to raise at this stage is that is health not being marketed enough? And is the return on investment on health not perhaps being talked about as much as it should be? Because I was reading an assessment by Melinda Gates, and she says that every dollar spent on child and mother actually helps us create $20 in economic development. Is that not happening enough? Are those statistics not being spoken of enough? And if not, why not?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. I think at a household level, individual level, people understand health issues when it happens to them. Your child is sick, your mother is sick, the cost it imposes on you. But at a policymaker level, it doesn't intuitively make sense as something that's going to be contributing to economic growth and development in the same way as, for example, building infrastructure or creating jobs. But in practice, there is a huge impact. The statistic you're talking about actually comes out of a commission on investing in health done by the Lancet magazine, which is that health-oriented magazine based out of the UK that we helped support, which was co-chaired by Larry Summers, the former Treasury Secretary and President of Harvard, which essentially is a panel of high-level economists from around the world which looked at this analysis and says, actually, the investments in health give you conservatively a 10x return on economic growth over the lifetime of that a healthy life built, someone who isn't crippled by disease, you don't have absenteeism, you don't have the cognitive underdevelopment from undernutrition, has a massive cumulative effect. But because it happens over the long term, it's less immediately apparent to governments and others, and so they often don't invest. The other thing that isn't understood is what I was citing earlier, which is the tremendous improvements that can happen over a relatively short space of time. To me, it's quite astonishing as someone who works in the field how little understood that is when you explain to people that we have in fact we've halved global child mortality, and in many countries cut it by 2/3 since 1990. People go, really? We've made that kind of progress even in countries like in Ethiopia? And you go, yes, we have. And that's why we need to double down. And so the marketing, if you like, is how do you tell a story of success at the statistic level, but then how do you also make it meaningful at a personal level to the household so they support it, and to the policymaker who understands the connection of why supporting investments in health actually is an investment in the broader productivity and economic growth of society.
You're perhaps right when you say that health is best understood when it's happening to you at a personal level and not when it's happening to a policy level. But the question I want to raise at this stage, and obviously it's very pertinent, is that the world is going through yet another crisis. There is an economic slowdown that global economy is seeing. At a time like this, do people like yourselves, who are important stakeholders in this initiative, fear that health may once again take a back seat? Because the whole talk is going to be about global financial markets, markets. The whole talk is going to be about hardcore economy, infrastructure building, not so much about health anymore, which is a very important initiative. But do you fear this may take a backseat once again?
Yeah, I think that is a real risk, and it's something that we really want to speak out and make sure doesn't happen, because again, the amounts of money we're talking about are relatively small investments proportionate to the sort of entire range of investments that take place across development. But also, even if you take the global financial crisis that started in 2008, the period between 2008 and 2013 actually saw some of the fastest rates of improvement, again, in health indicators across Asia and Africa that we've seen. And that's partly because you have some governments being relatively insulated. Actually, Africa was comparatively insulated from the financial crisis and still continued to grow heavily. But also because once you have an acceleration momentum in these areas, they build on themselves. You get stronger primary healthcare services, you get stronger nurse training, you get better commodity price supply chains to get cheaper vaccines into. And those are the bits, if you disrupt them, then rebuilding that is hugely difficult. But so the importance of continuing that and continuing to drive that, that's been true even in India. So that period 2008 to 2013 has seen a 6.6% annual reduction in child mortality, which is very, very fast rates, some of the fastest India has ever seen. And so we absolutely need to keep that momentum going, even as there are all these other very legitimate distractions around important issues driven by economic fundamentals.
We do hope that the legitimate distractions will not hijack the agenda that you're trying to push, because that's important. I want to focus and talk about the UN, which is looking to adopt sustainable development goals by September. We'll come to call to action in just a bit, but what, according to you, are the key areas that require attention at that level?
Well, the big shift that's happening from the expiry of the Millennium Development Goals, which were launched in 2000, and now what is going to be the launch of these new Sustainable Development Goals, is they're broadening the remit. The new goals are going to be universal. They apply to rich and poor countries alike, and they cover a much wider range of issues, ranging from jobs to the environment to social inclusion issues, as well as what's known as the unfinished agenda of the Millennium Development Goals. If you like, that's the core, and it fits in what's going to be the proposed first 6 to 7 goals of the SDGs, is we still know we only reduced child mortality by half. We reduced extreme poverty by half. How do we make sure that that shared prioritization remains front and center? And that's something that governments have broadly agreed to do. It's at the heart of the new Sustainable Development Goals document that we expect to be adopted at the UN next month. But the reality is, when you have a much wider set of priorities and you do have to allocate resources, how do we make sure that, again, the core momentum around the existing MDG agenda doesn't get lost, even as we also broaden and focus on these other very important issues such as the environment and climate change?
Let's shift focus to India and talk about India's own role in adopting these and outlining and working towards these goals. You're here for the Call to Action Summit. What exactly can India do to contribute and to execute some of these goals? Because the problems that you spoke about are very, very evidently of prime importance here in India.
Well, at the most obvious level, India, because of its enormous size and influence, means that if India doesn't succeed in meeting the Sustainable Development Goals, the world will not succeed.
That's right.
So at the very simplest and most basic level, India's success is fundamental to the world's success. But more important than that, India has in fact seen, I was just citing the statistic of the improvement in between 2008 and 2013, but even over the full MDG period, India has very nearly met the MDG on reducing child mortality by 2/3. The latest figures are a reduction by 62%, which is just short of that number. It's very impressive given the range of complexities and challenges that India faces and the wide divergence. India is many countries in one country. The difference in performance between the best performing states and the worst performing states is a factor of 3. And so what really India is going to need to do in this next phase is focus in on the sub-issues. Where are the biggest vulnerabilities? And from where we look, one of the biggest areas is neonatal mortality. That while India has made great progress on overall under 5 mortality and has continued to prove that it's still the deaths in the first month of life, India still disproportionately has a much higher rate than many other comparable countries. And on current trends in some of the big states like Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, while they'll meet the under 5 mortality goals probably a year or two after 2015, by 2019 or 2020, The neonatal goals, which will have a very specific target on current trends, won't be met till 2030. And so a greater focusing of attention on that critical period, which is about making sure that mothers are able to give birth in healthcare facilities, that there are basic tools and techniques to deal with newborns. Right. Again, that's going to be one very important area that we as the Gates Foundation are focused on, and that India currently has a sort of a relatively steeper hill to climb to reach success.
You know, while you talk about neonatal, infant mortality still continues to be a big issue here in India, and my own sense is, and after having read a lot on this, is that there is a clear gender bias to this entire issue. That's of course very specific and very common to India. The female feticide, for one, is very rampant. It disturbs me to no end, but for somebody like you who's trying to push this whole initiative, how frustrating is something like this?
Well, it clearly is frustrating, but it's one of a number of levers. So the whole issue of empowerment of women and girls broadly is actually something that also is at the heart of the new Sustainable Development Goals agenda. There was important reference to gender issues in the old Millennium Development Goals, but in the new goals, there's not only a standalone goal that calls out the critical importance of gender and women's empowerment to meet them, but in each of the goals around nutrition, around sanitation, around healthcare, around education, it's explicitly acknowledged that if you don't actually target, focus, and provide specific programs that empower women, you will not meet those targets again. Both because there is a gender difference in it, but also because, frankly, investing in, say, women to improve agricultural productivity, which is one of the targets, that when women gain extra income, they're far more likely to invest it in their children than men, frankly. Right. And so those investments in their children, in both in education, in nutrition, and healthcare, then lead to far better development outcomes in the other areas. And so there's a whole virtuous cycle, which if we don't explicitly take that on and acknowledge that, we simply won't meet the goals again. And in India, that is a particular challenge. It's one that I think the government is rising to, but you have to be very vigilant in making sure you're continuing to focus on it.
You know, while the government is beginning to focus on some of those challenges, but as someone like you who's operating in remote parts of the country, who's operating in states that were really not the focus area for the government to begin with, what are the challenges that you face other than the biases that we spoke about as you go to push poverty alleviation, health, environment issues in this country? If I were to ask you from a foundation point of view, the top 3 challenges that come your way, what would those be?
Well, I'd say there are several levels. One is at a community level, how do you actually incentivize behavior change? That's a broadly, so we're helping to...
Are Indians more resistant to behavior change than the rest of the world?
I don't think more resistant. I think this is a general problem that often India may have in some degrees more acute, partly because India still has a significantly more rural population and a larger rural population poverty, and often behavior change among rural populations is more difficult. It's more difficult in undereducated populations, and so an issue like sanitation and the Swachh Bharat mission, which we're being very supportive of, is a clear one where it's not just about building latrines and toilets and providing access, but about how do you incentivize use and end open defecation. And there's the supply and the demand component, and that's very difficult. There isn't like an easy answer. It's not like a textbook we hand you and say, and this is how you do it, and just tell the person how you...
So behavior change is one such challenge.
So behavior change is one. There's capacity for implementation. That's just again, abroad, when you want to operate at scale, the world of development that we operate in often has very successful pilot projects. And this is true, again, well beyond health. It can be in financial services, in agriculture, in nutrition, in sanitation. But when you want to scale, which means you want to reach not just tens of millions, but hundreds of millions of people, you need broad capacity. Say in Uttar Pradesh, where we're working with the state government, what are the tools you provide into primary healthcare facilities so that every nurse has the right training? Even if you have the training, are the supplies there? Do you have all the basic 20 commodities you need to provide disinfectant or provide basic antibiotics or whatever? Each step needs to be brought in, and it's a very challenging sort of set of connections to make. And to succeed in that, and then this is the third element, which I think is a foundation like ours, where our founders come out of the private sector, but we know that success requires partnering with government, is how do you pull in the private sector, government, and where appropriate, civil society to work together. That's a very common phrase. People talk a lot about public-private partnerships, but what are the ones that actually bring in the best of both partners? And that's often a constant challenge.
You know, you've actually tempted me to ask my next question, because this was on my mind. So while the government, yes, talks about sustainable development, and while the government does talk about focus on healthcare, the private sector hasn't really played a big part here in India, at least not so far. I mean, yes, there are philanthropic activities happening by some corporate houses, but not by all. How is the message of philanthropy best conveyed? I mean, yes, there is a Bill and a Melinda Gates out there doing this. There's a Warren Buffett who's trying to do that. There's a Azim Premji here in India who's trying to do this. But how do you get the rich to loosen their purse strings? Is that a constant challenge that you deal with? Do people not see the merit of philanthropy, and what changes can it make to people's lives?
Well, I think that is changing. There is, Bill and Melinda Gates and Warren Buffett did launch the Giving Pledge, which is this global initiative to encourage billionaires to commit to give away at least 50% of their wealth to the philanthropic endeavor of their choice. We're neutral about what the philanthropic endeavor can be, but something that they say that you should be passionate about. And Azim Premji is, in fact, the first Indian to join the Giving Pledge and has made a commitment and is working extensively in education here, as you know. I think the more we've worked in that area with other philanthropists, I think there have been two sets of challenges. One is philanthropists or potential philanthropists tend to be very wealthy businessmen and women who are used to success in whatever field they've been working in. And philanthropy is a challenging field. The areas we work in are not areas where success is easy. Well, yes. Hopefully we can start to measure them, but success is difficult. Warren Buffett articulated it very well in an early meeting of the foundation after he first announced he would give the Gates Foundation the bulk of his fortune. And we'd asked him, what are the lessons we should learn from your private sector investing? And he said, you shouldn't learn very much from my private sector investing, because when I make private sector bets, I'm very confident of success. And if I wanted to be very confident of success in philanthropy, I would build a park, because I can tell you I could build the world's best park. It would be beautiful. But the areas I'm asking you to work on, in tuberculosis, in HIV/AIDS, these are very challenging. To use a baseball metaphor, it's not cricket, he said, if you're not swinging and missing, although it could work with cricket, then you're probably not being ambitious enough. And so it's how you connect the ambition of the goals to say, but actually even within that, you may have some failures, but you also have some very important successes, and the risk capital that you can provide as philanthropy, because philanthropists hopefully are less risk averse than governments, that can help catalyze really fundamental change. And I think that message is starting to get through, including here in India.
New age philanthropy is very different from the old age philanthropy, which was happening in confines of, anonymity, so to say. The new age philanthropy has people out there who are trying to push for a cause, who are trying to partner governments at large. As you do that, what are some of the policy changes that you would want to see in India? Yes, there is a Swachh Bharat initiative. Yes, there is a sustainable healthcare initiative. But are there policy changes that you would particularly push for here in this country?
Well, I think the policy framework that the government set out and the ambition in the areas from financial inclusion to sanitation to immunization rollouts are actually all the right ones. The key is in the execution and how you measure and how you get accountability. And you raise the issue of how do you measure for results in these things, and how do you find out what intervention works or doesn't work. So, for example, in the area of financial inclusion, where we've been providing some technical support and advice to the Reserve Bank of India and the Finance Ministry with some of the sort of recent steps here, we're also looking, for example, at doing a specific study, which likely will be here in Delhi, which is a randomized controlled trial of some groups of people who will get access to some digital financial services and some groups of people who wouldn't. So you're trying to find out which are the best interventions and why. And you have to constantly look and try and provide that evidence base, which is difficult to do. It's not, a bureaucrat isn't incentivized to find and look for that. Yes. And again, that's something as the new philanthropy, we can help provide that almost as a public good into the government. So here's the tool, here the evidence of which interventions and partnerships work best and why. And so I think that's one very central element of what you describe as the new philanthropy, which is looking at outcomes. It's not enough to be passionate about the issues. That's important. It's how do you measure the outcomes, and how do you then change and course correct when what you're working on isn't being successful.
Fair point indeed. Let's move to the bigger picture now. Poverty continues to be one of the key hurdles that the UN is combating with at a global level, and specifically true for countries in Asia and Africa. In 2000, the UN had laid out a roadmap to meet the needs of the world's poorest. We're talking in August of 2015. Do you believe enough has been done and enough achieved?
Well, certainly if you look back at what expectations were in 2000, and I was working at the United Nations in 2000 when the Millennium Declaration was launched, and I can tell you there was enormous skepticism. People looked and said, really? Halve global poverty? That's ridiculous. We're never going to be able to do this. It's just another example of UN hot air. Reduce child mortality by 2/3, it'll never happen. Put all boys and girls in school. We've said that before. And actually, that's been fun. When we look back, we certainly haven't achieved everything. There's still big gaps in some of the areas, critical areas like sanitation. Some areas we're missing, like the environment and climate change. But I think the successes have far outweighed anybody's expectations back in 2000. And part of the reason for that is these were time-bound, measurable, and credible targets. So they actually helped galvanize governments, private sector, civil society, multilateral agencies, all around common goals, which may not sound a challenging thing to do, but had never happened in global development before. And when that happens, and you combine that with successful interventions, then results also happen. So I think trying to learn from that and distill what the best of that is, but also not, I think one of the risks going forward is you think that's applicable everywhere and that we can do the same in multiple sectors and say, you know, we do have a broad new agenda with the SDGs. I think trying to remain focused and disciplined in key areas where interventions are going to be most successful, that doesn't come naturally to intergovernmental and UN processes, and I think that's going to require some real effort.
So, you know, while poverty alleviation is one pain point, quality and perhaps more affordable healthcare is quite another. It is far from reality in many, many countries around the world, and obviously it's top priority for people like yourselves. At a more government-private partnership at a UN level, what can be done to ensure this happens? Because this is not just a problem that's specific to India or specific to a developing nation. It's also true for the developed world. I mean, affordable healthcare is a point of pain that haunts the world right now.
Yeah, so there's several elements. One is to sort of double down on some of the interventions and partnerships that have proven success. So a great example is Gavi, which is the Global Alliance to support vaccines and immunization, which provides extensive support in India. That was set up in 2000, shortly after the Millennium Development Goals were launched. And what that does, when we talked about public-private partnership, that pools donor resources together in pooled funding. It goes to private sector manufacturers, including a number of large Indian pharmaceutical and vaccine manufacturers, to help drive down costs. Because it can afford to purchase at scale for the global market, the costs come way down. That means you can purchase a much larger amount of vaccines to cover many, many more children, and then you work on the distribution. So for us, that's a perfect example of public-private partnership. And in fact, the latest round to replenish Gavi was hosted by Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany in January of this year and raised $7.5 billion. And so we've got to back successful interventions like that. We've got to look for what are the Gavi equivalents in some of the other sectors where we don't yet have them, like in sanitation, like in sort of broader areas that the Gates Foundation may not be as involved in, but areas like education, which are critically important.
That's right.
And sort of try and take that same model through. The second is, I'd say, is to build on the micro-level successes that exist. A lot of this is about training and providing community healthcare workers. So it's when we talk about the reductions in child mortality, often people look, or the broader MDG program, say, well, wasn't that all progress in China? And we go, absolutely not. This is, in Africa alone, you have Tanzania, you have Malawi, you have Ethiopia, are all countries, Rwanda, that have met the child mortality target.
Right, yes.
In fact, Rwanda, by some measures, has had the fastest rates of improvement in child mortality reduction over the last 5 years of any country in human history. I mean, these are amazing statistics which, again, aren't understood. And
that's a story that doesn't get spoken about.
Absolutely not.
I have a last question to ask of you. While you make this public push, while you advocate this around the world with policymakers, with the rich industrialists, what kind of a role can communication and digital media, because that's really getting a lot of mind space, at least in the the minds of young, influential people. What sort of a role can digital media play in an initiative like this to spread public awareness? The SDG, the MDG that the UN is looking to adopt. What kind of a role can a communication channel like this play?
Well, I think it's going to be an indispensable role, to be honest, because digital communication is the fundamental tool by which particularly younger people today access and get access to their news and engage with the outside world. And so how you both tell the story of success, because I say, again, we have lots of polling data which show people simply don't believe the success I've been describing is happening. So to that degree, organizations like us have clearly done a relatively poor job at explaining why it's actually okay to be an impatient optimist and there are good reasons to be optimistic. And so I think there's some partnership there. But how you do that in ways that are graphically interesting, that allow for real interactive engagement, again, for younger people are often looking for ways, this is great, what can I do? How can I engage back? How can I, that's where I think the digital tools and the toolboxes are going to be so critical to helping reach the next set of goals.
We appreciate you taking time out and talking about this very important issue right here on ET Now. Thanks
Great.
very much, Mark.
Thank you very much.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/etnow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at etnowlive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/etnow.